All right, welcome to the Potter's House this morning. And what we're going to start doing is doing a pre-recorded message in the morning to show in Dayton. And then on the evening here at the Potter's House. And the reason we want to do this is so that for time purposes and an opportunity to have longer discussions, we can actually watch the teaching while we're eating and then give more time for discussion and fellowship afterwards and other things that we'd like to do. I think what we will also start doing next week is having this part of it live on YouTube, so people can tune in and watch our pre-recording live, and then we will be using the pre-recorded message for our fellowship in the morning in Dayton and then in the evening here in Xenia. All right, so we're continuing in our interlude in the book of Romans, and we've been parked in Romans for a long time, and rightfully so. There is just so much confusion in our day concerning justification and sanctification. And so from time to time, we've been doing interludes in our Romans series, and this one is on predestination. And the reason I decided to do a journey in the whole question of predestination is because predestination really, as far as sanctification and an active Christian life, has really paralyzed God's people, from what I can see, since I've been a Christian since 1983. So we're delving in, starting to think about this issue of predestination in different ways, and I think the Lord is beginning to teach us some key things accordingly. The title of the message this morning is The Gospel of Sovereignty. The Gospel of Sovereignty. Well, I started out my study, and you can see there in your notes, I have a definition of sovereignty. And it's the quality or state of being sovereign. It really means authority. Rightful status, as you can see there, independence, a sovereign state. The quality of being sovereign. You can see all of the definitions there. The sovereignty of God is a phrase that we hear often in Christian circles. In fact, it is a subject that dominates Christian discussion in our day. Moreover, it is an attribute of God that Christians make intrinsic to the gospel itself. In my contention against progressive justification in our day, the argument I hear most is, you don't understand the sovereignty of God. What are they saying? You don't understand the gospel because you don't understand the sovereignty of God. Now, per the usual, I came out of this year's conference with something new, all right? And really some things that John Emmel said, and really some things that Bo Grissom said, and some things that Andy said, got me to thinking about this. Sovereignty, this phrase, the sovereignty of God, being made synonymous with the gospel or the good news. And no wonder one of the premier evangelicals of our day, John MacArthur Jr., had this to say in a message titled, and get this, An Explanation of the Sovereign Gospel. Okay? Here's what he said. So we know it has been laid upon us to be faithful in our evangelical responsibility. At the same time, sometimes we struggle with this reality of divine sovereignty and what it is that we can do when everything is predetermined by God and worked by the Holy Spirit. Notice here what his definition of sovereignty is. Pretty clear, right? Well, the simple answer to the question is God has not only ordained, and let me stop right there. So then, his definition of sovereignty is control, predeterminative control, all right? He uses the word there, predetermined by God. So God is complete control and causal of everything that happens. Control may be the most working word here. John MacArthur continues, well, the simple answer to this question is God has not only ordained whom he will save, but he has ordained that we in our faithful evangelism will be the means by which he would save him. So again, his definition of sovereignty is pretty clear here, no? To be useful to him is the purpose in the fulfillment of his sovereign plan. To be an instrument that he can use. I'm sorry, I don't want to get down a rabbit track, but this is astounding to me that the academiacs of our day, who are lifted up as these, brilliant theologians. Do you notice the contradiction here? He's talking about somebody God can use, the possibility of God using somebody to evangelize. Well, wait a minute. I thought everything was predetermined. Which is it? Anyway, to be a vessel unto honor, fit for the master's use. To be obedient because that brings, of course, blessings. Reward in this life and eternal reward as well. Okay? Of course, if God has predetermined who will be saved and uses our evangelism to carry that out, our obedience to evangelism must be preordained as well. No? Yes? As discussed in a previous lesson in this series, this necessarily requires the redefining of the words obedience and reward, as well as many other words in the normative understanding of them. And this is my argument in a previous lesson. And it's one of those arguments where you think, wow, this is really a strong argument, but people don't seem to be that impressed with the argument, but I am. I mean, when you've got to redefine the normative meanings of words as we've known them, and you've got this great big long list of redefining words like obedience, reward, judgment, on and on and on. All of those words, as we normally understand them, have to be redefined. That should be a red flag. So anyway, as well as many other words in the normative understanding of them, but the main point I want to make here is MacArthur making salvation synonymous with sovereignty, which is defined as control. Herein is the problem. The word sovereign does not mean control. It means that one has the right to have authority in a given jurisdiction. Even some among the Reformed admit this. Not many. But I have a quotation here from somebody from the Reformed community, and what he says is the following. What does it mean to say that God is sovereign? The refrain has become so common, almost cliched in Reformed writing and preaching, that it sometimes slips away from the reader or listener without lodging meaning in the mind. And by the way, that's a good point, I must admit, and the same with the word gospel. The word gospel is thrown around in our churchianity in this country without, quote, lodging any meaning in the mind. It's just this generic stopgap in our grammar that enables preachers to proliferate anything they want from the pulpit by filling in the gaps with the word gospel. Anyway, worse, we typically hear the phrase to mean something it doesn't. When Christians affirm that God is, quote, God is sovereign, they often mean God is in control. Paul David Tripp, for example, wrote in his excellent book, Lost in the Middle, and by the way, this drives me crazy about Reformed writers. When are people going to get sick of this and come out from among them and be separate? Okay? Paul Tripp doesn't even know the definition of sovereign, but yet the book is, quote, excellent. Which is it? If the guy doesn't even know what the definition of sovereign is, but the book is excellent, anyway. All right, Paul Tripp, for example, wrote in his excellent book, Lost in the Middle, that quote, God truly is sovereign. There is no situation, relationship, or circumstance that is not controlled by our Heavenly Father. All right, again, like John MacArthur, it's pretty clear here what their definition of sovereign is. The problem is that the English word sovereignty does not mean control. The U.S. government is sovereign within American territory, but that doesn't mean that the government controls everything within the American borders or causes all that happens. If you look up sovereignty in the dictionary, you'll not find control in the definition, nor even as a synonym in the thesaurus. So the idea of control or predetermination doesn't even slip in as a synonym. All right? Okay? It's not even in the ballpark. Sovereignty means rightful authority. A dictionary gives supreme rank is one definition, and a thesaurus lists jurisdiction and dominion as synonyms. The doctrine of God's sovereignty tells us God is the rightful ruler of the universe. He has legitimate claim to lordship. His government is just. In fact, justice is defined as his rule. Okay? And by the way, let me slip this in. I can't wait for the millennial kingdom. All of the injustice, God is just. You know, just is a very important metaphysical paradigm. Okay? Of course, as I keep trying to teach people in regard to Protestantism, Protestants don't see justice that way, and it's in our culture, because of our culture's presuppositions concerning man and the church as well. The lack of justice just drives you nuts, okay? The millennial kingdom is going to be reality as we know it now, redone, except there's going to be justice. And that, my friends, is going to be 1,000 years of pure delight to see rightful judgment being executed time and time and time again, because the Lord Jesus Christ is ruling the earth with an iron scepter from David's throne in Jerusalem. Ah. Anyway, forgot to put my finger in a place when I went down my rabbit trap. Where am I at here?
In fact, justice is defined.
Okay, thank you. In fact, I'm sorry, it's government. Okay, in fact, justice is defined as his rule. God's sovereignty doesn't tell us whether God does in fact rule, just that he ought to. In that, we should acknowledge his rule and obey it. Okay, so just because God has sovereign rule, or it's his right to rule, doesn't mean he does. Okay? Well, if this guy's right, and I think he is, what's that say about free will? Herein, we have a definition of free will. All right? It's God's sovereign right to rule, but yet instead of him seizing on that rightful authority, he temporarily, how could I say this? It's the difference between that and free will, because God allows free will. He doesn't, in fact, dictate everything, though he has a right to. And we talk about that a little more. Now, Miller goes on to say, once again, it is true God is sovereign. It's also true he's in control of everything that happens, and he causes all that happens. All right? He says, as a good Reformed guy, he concedes that to be the truth. But that is the doctrine of God's providence, not his sovereignty. All right? Now, what we're going to find out now is he's wrong about the word providence. Okay? Does God cause everything to happen? Well, perhaps, but that's not what providence means either. These guys can't get anything right. You can use them every now and then to because they phrase things good in a way to show how the other guy is wrong, but then it's to some point they're going to be wrong about what they're saying the other guy is wrong about. These guys are completely upside down on everything. All right? Providence, look at the definition here. The foreseeing care and guidance of God or nature over the creatures of the earth. All right? God, especially when conceived as omnisciently directing the universe. There you go. I'm not going to read any more of this definition. It's there. Look, watch this. And this is from a secular dictionary. Omnisciently directing. How do you like that? Omnisciently directing. All right? Again, the more we study predestination, we're saying that God predetermines good outcomes, okay, overall. All right? History is going to have a happy ending. That's where we get our hope that we are to hang on to. All right? First, the word sovereign appears nowhere in the Bible, which should give people pause in regard to the forgiveness, to the frivolousness of its use in Christian circles. Stop right there. Okay. So I start to get into this study because the term, the quote, sovereign gospel after this past conference starts raising red flags in my mind. Wait a minute here. And this is the importance, the utter importance of these conferences. Every one of these conferences, I've come away with things that are red flags in my mind that weren't even on my radar screen before. All right? Happens every year. So I start the study, and I'm like, okay, that's the definition of sovereignty. What is the biblical definition of sovereignty? So I get out my concordance, start looking. Wait a minute. Where is it? What do you mean the word sovereign isn't in Strong's Concordance? What's going on here? Okay. I was stunned. I was stunned. Now, the NIV and some of the more modern translations stick the English word sovereign in there, but it's not in any of the original manuscripts. Okay? They put it in there because the word Lord has this exact idea of sovereignty, as in master, okay, the right to rule over you. So they stick it in there, or as the argument goes, they would have to put in Lord, Lord. They just think it's necessary to, define what is meant by Lord by putting another word in there. Now, I haven't done a lot of study on this. I'm still reeling from and perhaps some of the readers or Andy can correct me on this, but I was stunned. Are you kidding me? To the degree that this word is thrown around in the church today, it's not even in the Bible? Wow. Okay? So anyway, secondly, it does not mean control, preordination, or predetermination. Certainly, if God wanted to control everything, he could. But does he? Did God know sin was going to come into the world? Yes. Why didn't he prevent it beforehand? The best answer points to the importance of free will. Stop right there. What I am beginning to see is that, in fact, what is paramount in the whole question of our metaphysical existence in relationship to the gospel is that free will is paramount. And I am beginning to suspect that all the hoopla about election and this, that, and the other is an all-out viral affront against this whole idea of free will. Okay? Now, the problem that we have is that the arguments on all of this are very poor, and there isn't the theological math of justification and sanctification are not considered. Now, as we know, what began to really persuade me to delve into this deeply and really look at it is the fact that everybody would agree that for the most part, for the extreme most part, all of this argument for predestination and election and being understood in the context of plenary control comes from Protestantism and the Reformed camp. Problem, they're not even right about the gospel. Okay, so if they're not even right about the gospel, if they don't have the law right, if they don't have law and gospel right, if they don't have justification right, and if they have butchered sanctification, well then, if all of the ideas that come from predestination come from them, shouldn't we take another look? I think so. And that's what we're doing here at the Potter's House. God did not cause sin by not preventing it. God tempts no one with sin and is not the creator of evil. James 1, 13 through 18. Okay. When the attributes of God are considered, most theologians name 21 different attributes. Absolute deterministic control is not one of them. All right? Even with set attributes, God at times chooses to forfeit the attribute for a period of time. Therefore, if God is predeterminist, he wouldn't always necessarily choose to predetermine. Some attributes of God are temporarily mutable, and others are not ever mutable. An immutable attribute of God is his love towards mankind for all the living. Clearly, an example of an attribute that God has temporarily suspended at times is omniscience. Genesis 18:20. Then the Lord said, because the outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah is great, and their sin is very grave, I will go down to see whether they have done altogether according to the outcry that has come to me. And if not, I will know. Obviously, God chose not to know definitively if the reports that came to him were true or not. If this isn't legitimate, why all the drama? Okay? Why put that in there if God really knew but didn't have to investigate? Now, you know, I'm gonna get the emails right and left. Actually, some time ago at a Reformed church, I was teaching a home fellowship. And do you remember the event in the Bible where where Jesus was in the crowd and he said, "Who touched me? I felt power go out of me. Who touched me?" And the disciples, you know, there's this throng pressing up against us, and you ask us, you know, I just love the discourse in the Bible between the disciples and Jesus. Jesus, that's a stupid question. How do we know? You know, why are you even asking that? All right. Well, I suggested that Jesus really didn't know who touched him. Whoa, man. I mean, people who normally are soft-spoken, so on and so forth, you know, the claws in the teeth just came out. I was just attacked, okay? And this controversy went on during the week at church, even, all right? But look at Mark 13:32. Jesus said, "But concerning that day or that hour, no one knows, not even the angels in heaven, nor the Son, but only the Father." This is pretty clear, okay? Jesus, at that point in time, who was God, did not know the time of the day of the Lord. This is pretty clear, okay? Also, yes, in regard to some things, yes. Also, yes, in regard to some things, God is immutable, but in contrast, he can be persuaded by prayer. So what am I saying in all of this? God has attributes. God has attributes. So what the Reformed camp has done is taken the attribute of his sovereignty, used the word wrongly in the first place, but then posit the idea that that attribute of God is always applied 100% throughout all eternity and being. Okay? So basically, the extreme view is that God never changes. That's an attribute of God. But be careful, because, how should I say this? If yes, it's true God is immutable, but that doesn't mean he's immutable in every case. The idea that reality and being and truth and good is plenarily immutable is whose idea? Plato. That's Platonism. Okay? That's Platonism. Now, Isaiah 38:1. In those days, Hezekiah became sick and was at the point of death. And Isaiah the prophet, the son of Amos, came to him and said to him, Thus saith the Lord, Set your house in order, for you shall die. You shall not recover. Then Hezekiah turned his face to the wall and prayed to the Lord, and said, Please, O Lord, remember how I have walked before you in faithfulness and with a whole heart, and have done what is good in your sight. And Hezekiah wept bitterly. Then the word of the Lord came to Isaiah, Go and say to Hezekiah, Thus says the Lord, the God of David your father, I have heard your prayer, I have seen your tears. Behold, I will add 15 years to your life. All right? I will deliver you and the city out of the hand of the king of Assyria, and will defend his city. So we see that God, yes, is in total control. God can give Hezekiah as many years as he want to, but for this reason, that reason, or the other reason, it's not necessarily set in stone before the foundation of the world. Prayer, as the saying goes, changes things. Okay? Jesus encouraged us in the Gospels to always pray and never give up. All right? Listen, you can't get around the fact that this predeterminism takes the vigor out of prayer and evangelism. You absolutely can't get around that. That if your psyche is saying, why pray? God's already decided what's going to happen. Why pray? Okay? Chronicles 2 Chronicles 16:12. In the 39th year of his reign, Asa was afflicted with a disease in his feet. Though his disease was severe, even in his illness he did not seek help from the Lord, but only the physicians. As my old father in the faith, beginning mentor down in Dallas, Texas, used to say, the Honorable Reverend Peacock, son, pray and go to the doctor. The Bible teaches to pray and go to the doctor. Just don't pray. You got to go to the doctor too. Okay? The two work together. This guy, because of his good old-fashioned common sense, was way ahead of the curve on everything. As a pastor in the 90s counseling people, invariably, as good Protestants, they would come to me for counsel, and when asked what they had done about the problem, it was always, well, we've prayed about it. Well, what else have you done? Well, What else would we do? God is in control. You know, we're not going to run around trying to fix the problem. You know, we've got to depend on God. All right. He was way ahead of the curve on this. Pray by all means, but do something. As Christians, if you have a problem, you not only have to pray, you've got to do something. Okay? We have established that sovereign, the word sovereign, would be the wrong word to describe God as causing all that happens. Okay? And those things being according to his desired will. It has also been mentioned that the word sovereign is not in the Bible. Even if sovereign did mean that all things are predetermined according to God's pleasure, would it be correct to make that part and parcel with the gospel as most do in our day? Below is yet another version of the infamous cross chart that can be applied to this question. And you have, Susan, the chart there in your notes. The problem is defining, you see, again, man can't have any free will. To the extent that man has free will in anything, the gospel gets smaller. It's funny how I'm learning that this cross chart can be applied to every question in life and used to show the folly of Reformed thought. Basically, and I guess I should thank them for coming up with this chart, it's their greatest argument against them. But you see how the only logical conclusion that this comes to is man is completely out of the loop. Therefore, what do we have? We have what Susan talked about regarding the Puritans. All of reality is a pre-written gospel narrative. You're just players in the pre-written narrative. If you believe you're just a player in the sovereignty of God, that's saving faith. If you believe you can make your own narrative of life, that's a false gospel. All right? The problem is defining the gospel according to God's sovereignty as opposed to God's love and the good news thereof. Did you catch that? Okay? Why would the idea that God preordained people to hell be good news? What I'm saying here is this. The gospel has been redefined and predicated on the attribute of God's sovereignty, which they use the very word the wrong way, preface. The gospel, the good news, has been predicated on this one attribute of God, clearly, sovereignty, instead of his attribute of what? Love. Okay? All of God's attributes don't necessarily predicate the gospel, but they've taken this one and made it synonymous with the gospel. This also speaks to man's worth. Did Christ die for humanity because it has some kind of, did Christ die for humanity because it has some kind of worth to God, that is humanity? We can again utilize the cross chart for this question. All right? So again, look at the chart there. To the degree that man has worth, the extent of God's grace and mercy is subtracted from, and again, the cross gets smaller. And this is one of the arguments for living by the cross. The more we see, here it goes, the more we see how evil we are, the more we appreciate what Christ did on the cross. Okay? So an emphasis is put on Christ's death on the cross that Christ doesn't put there. Okay? And look, I've had some interesting exchanges this week with people, and this is one of John's Emmel's big arguments for his position. Read the gospel for yourself. How much did Christ really emphasize his death? Okay? So then you begin to grasp where John Emmel is coming from in his death and life construct, which I'm not saying I agree with. But what John points to is the fact, okay, out of all that Jesus taught, what did he emphasize? His death or life? Right.
And kingdom living.
Kingdom living. I came that man may have
Life and have it more abundantly.
and have it more abundantly. Okay? So, to the extent that man has worth, the gospel gets smaller and God's grace as the degree of his sacrifice are diminished. A gospel based on the sovereignty of God must completely eliminate man altogether. And John Emmel's point made in this year's Tank Conference is well taken. It eventually boils down to man having no right to exist. Okay? No? Yes? That's the only logical conclusion. All of this greatly hinders the proper answering of questions people have about the Bible. And let me back up a little bit. Jesus said, in the latter days, the hearts of man will wax cold. Love will be practically non-existent. Well, hello, if the predominant attitude is that man has no right to exist, hello, no value on life, hello, as Calvin said, we're just worms crawling upon the earth. Hello, okay? So you watch on TV this ISIS crowd summarily executing people on a whim, just snuffing out their lives, and, well, why wouldn't you? They're just worms, right? When I see that on TV, I think of all of those men's families, the terror they're experiencing, knowing that their life is about to be snuffed out in an instant. That's what I think about. But as good Protestants, shouldn't we rather look at them and think, oh, well, they're just worms, okay? Are we still flashing? Good. All of this greatly hinders the proper answering of questions people have about the Bible. Take note of John Piper's answer to the question, why was it right for God to slaughter women and children in the Old Testament? How can that be right? Here is John Piper's answer. It's right for God to slaughter women and children anytime he pleases. Notice that it's not the slaughterers who are slaughtering women and children. It's God doing it through them. Okay? God is just merely using them, and he determined to do that before the foundation of the world. Just like John MacArthur said, when you evangelize, it's not really you doing it. God predetermined that you would obey that command before the foundation of the world. Well, Paul, where do you get that? Because everyone who saves is predetermined. So those who lead them to Christ, that action has to be predetermined as well. Okay? So, anyway, Piper says it's right for God to slaughter women and children anytime he pleases. God gives life and he takes life. Everybody who dies because God wills that they die. So notice that God doesn't have, there aren't different definition of God's will in the Bible. There's only one definition, what he preordains. Okay? Again, that's a problem that I'm not going to get into here, but we did address that, what? 3 or 4 weeks ago in this same series. God is taking life every day, Piper says. He will take 50,000 lives today. Life is in God's hand. God decides when your last heartbeat will be and whether it ends through cancer or a bullet wound. God governs. Okay? God governs. Does God govern? Or is it omniscient guidance? Okay? And as part of that guidance, teaching and preaching and then giving people the choice. So God is God. He rules and governs everything. And everything he does is just and right and good. God owes us nothing. If I were to drop dead right now, or a suicide bomber downstairs were to blow this building up, and I were blown into smithereens, God would have done me no wrong. He does no wrong to anybody when he takes their life, whether at 2 weeks or at age 92. Stop right there. So if God uses somebody to wipe out a crowd of people, no wrong has been done. Right? Because God merely used men to do it, and he did it. Do you know now, people listening on the internet, do you know now why there's no justice in the Protestant church? Okay?
Because if this is true of God, it pleases God to use man to do that, then we have no reason for laws in the land to prosecute these people. It's God. God did it, so we don't need to prosecute people.
And think of John as you will. As we know, I don't agree with John on everything, but if not for John, these light bulbs aren't coming on for us. Okay? Think about it. And it's like, duh, it's like something I saw on Facebook the other day that you're just blown away by, but you're like, that's stupid. Why didn't I think of that? Ladies, do you ever have a recipe where you cut grapes in half? Some guy on Facebook takes a plate, puts a bunch of grapes in them, turns another plate upside down, squeezes them in the middle, puts it on a counter, and then takes a big old knife and goes in between the plates. Done. So you look at that and you're like, that's so stupid. That's so simple. Why didn't I think of that? This is the same kind of thing. Okay? Anyway, Piper continues, God is not beholden to us at all. He doesn't owe us anything. Now add to that the fact that we're all sinners and deserve to die and go to hell. Yesterday. And the reality that we're even breathing today is sure common grace from God. Note that. I could make the question harder. As it was stated, it doesn't feel hard to me because God was stated as the actor. My basic answer is that the Old and New Testament presents God as the one who has total rights over my life and over my death. Okay? And as we're looking at, that's absolutely true, but how is it applied by God? The Bible tells us, and it's not their definition of that. He quotes Job 121, the Lord gave and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. How he takes away is his call. He never wrongs anybody. He never wrongs anybody. So again, if he uses some guy to murder somebody and that's God's will, ultimately, what do you want to do to the guy who is merely God's instrument to do the deed? Now look, whether it's Luther, and by the way, this is Luther, this is Calvin. If you do a lot of reading of Luther and Calvin, like I do, you read this stuff from Piper, and by the way, the Puritans, you read this stuff from Piper and you go, yeah, that's Luther, that's Calvin. So ultimately, that's also Plato too. Now do you know why you look out into the world and you're just driven nuts by the lack of justice? Heard on the news the other day about a couple in, I think, Philadelphia, a family who stopped at a gas station. 2 young daughters and a husband and a wife. They were mercilessly beaten severely by a crowd of youth. Okay? The police gave them a ticket for disorderly conduct and cut them loose. The husband and the wife were put in the hospital. They were beaten so bad. The husband had a broken eye socket, a broken nose. Okay? They listen. The roots of this comes from Plato, Luther, and Calvin. This lack of human worth and human dignity. Okay? The idea that man is no longer created in the image of God. When he sinned, now he is created in the image of Adam, and all of that is worthless. We are worth no more than a worm crawling on the ground. Okay? This is going to have results. Okay? In essence, you see the mentality in this answer that man does not have the right to exist. Getting back to John's use of words in describing this. Man has no right to exist and has no worth. Yet, quoting here, and you know what? I didn't put the citation there. I need to look up that citation. But the Lord said, they shall be mine, says the Lord of hosts, in the day when I make up my treasured possession. And I will spare them as a man spares his son who serves him. John Piper has been called out many times publicly for making these kinds of statements in regard to tragedies, but no one seems to understand the ideology behind such statements. Some also notice tacit acceptance of terrorism as well, and the lack of justice in the institutional church for those who have been abused speaks for itself. If the president of the flagship seminary in service to the largest denomination in the world thinks that, quote, one man's terrorist is another man's patriot, what are we to expect? When one thinks of life past the fatalistic prism of the, quote, sovereign gospel that saturates today's church and reads the Bible in the same thinking way, much better answers evolve. Unfortunately, life teaches us that terrorists cannot be reasoned with. I heard a retired high-ranking military official state this week that the only way to deal with terrorists is to eliminate them. Keep in mind, this is because they do not value mankind or life because of the same presuppositions that we are discussing. When Israel was getting ready to enter the Promised Land, it could very well be that God knew certain cultures in the area would continually harass Israel and were completely unreasonable while having no regard for life. Israel's lack of obedience in following God's command to completely wipe out certain cultures came back to bite them for hundreds of years, even until this day. These were cultures very much like ISIS, the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, who are presently wreaking havoc on the Middle East and mercilessly slaughtering thousands. These people, unfortunately, cannot be negotiated with. Why? Because of their view of man and the fact that man has no right to exist. Okay? Lastly, another problem with a gospel that is based on deterministic fatalism follows. There is only one person spoken of less in our day than the Holy Spirit, Satan. The Bible warns us throughout to be aware of the devil's schemes and that he, quote, deceives the world. Why would this be relevant, and how do you deceive someone who is already preordained for eternal punishment? The Bible continually places blame on Satan for leading people into condemnation. Okay? So Satan is continually blamed for being able to persuade people into condemnation. This speaks again to free will. In the final analysis, a sovereign gospel devalues prayer, God's promises, evangelism, sin, justice, hope, life value, future reward, and the belief that what we do in this life is relevant. I have come to believe that people will perish because we have been neutralized by ignorance. Okay? Ezekiel 3:16. And at the end of 7 days, the word of the Lord came to me. Son of man, I have made you a watchman for the house of Israel. Whenever you hear a word from my mouth, you shall give them warning from me. If I say to the wicked, you shall surely die, and you give him no warning, nor speak to warn the wicked from his wicked way in order to save his life, see the cause and effect there, that wicked person shall die for his iniquity, but his blood I will require at your hand. But if you warn the wicked, and he does not turn from his wickedness or from his wicked way, he shall die for his iniquity, but you will have delivered your soul. Again, if a righteous person turns from his righteousness and commits injustice, and I lay a stumbling block before him, he shall die. Because you have not warned him, he shall die for his sin, and his righteous deeds that he has done shall not be remembered. But his blood I will require at your hand. But if you warn the righteous person not to sin, and he does not sin, he shall surely live, because he took warning, and you will have delivered your soul. John MacArthur claims that Christians should take part in God's sovereign plan and therefore find blessings in being obedient to evangelism. I have heard this same take from people who equate free will with an unsovereign gospel, false gospel. Again, God's sovereignty is the attribute that primarily drives the gospel and not love. But the following is irrefutable. Such obedience must also be preordained and not really our own volition. Furthermore, the reward is invalid as well. I have also come to believe that there is no paradoxes in God's election. I believe the confusion can be eliminated and people motivated to labor in God's ministry field with zeal. But I believe the study will be very hard work. Nevertheless, let us begin.